All right, Mike. Well, we're in chapter 2, and chapter 2 is entitled, it's a short chapter, but it's entitled Life is, After All, Difficult. And I guess we all know that all of us experience difficulties and struggles throughout life, and I guess unfortunately for us, we come to the realization that many of those difficulties are the result of our own doing. So since this chapter is really focused on men, I think, how they handle difficulties, looking back at your life and the difficulties or struggles that you've had in your life, how do you see yourself having handled those and responding to those?
Well, that's a good question, John. And I thought when I was growing up, why does somebody have as many struggles as I do? And then on page 7 of the book, it kind of, God gives us that hint ahead of time where he tells Moses in Psalm 90, he says, 70 years are given to us. Some may even reach 80, but even the best of those years are filled with pain and trouble. Soon they disappear and we are gone. So even though, we live to be 80 and we have some difficult years and we have some good years, even the good years, there'll be difficulty and pain. And I think that is obviously a result of sin that came into the world right in the Garden of Eden. But before I became a Christian at 19, and things, I couldn't understand why I was having these difficulties, and obviously I did not want to share those with my friends. Did not want to admit my weaknesses. To me, they looked like they didn't ever have struggles or weaknesses, and so I tried to make sure that they didn't see mine. I really felt like I was on my own on that. Had to hide the problems from my friends, and obviously did not want to admit my mistakes. But after I became a Christian, things slowly began to change. They didn't change overnight. But I knew I had a Father who deeply cared about me, a Father in heaven who had created me. And I knew as a person that I could ask for forgiveness from. And so that relationship developed, and over time, I really did want to please my Father in heaven, but it is still a very difficult thing not to want to please men and try to continue to hide my weaknesses and my difficulties from them. And I do worry today about what God thinks about things more so than I ever have in the past, but I still find myself, and I'm saddened at times when I also feel like I'm hiding it from family or friends. So.
Yeah, and I like you, have seen how I've handled struggles and difficulties in life, many of which are my own doing, as sort of a progression. When I was younger, I think I really, in the face of coming to grips with failures, I would either try to blame it on someone else, which I think younger people sometimes have a tendency to do, looking for excuses, kind of denying what the evidence of the failure is, or and then progression might be then in the face of failure you tend to wallow in guilt or shame about kind of beating yourself up because you didn't do better, and then as a result of that you sort of try to hide, like you said, hide your failures from God and from others. And it was only when I came to the realization, I think, of what God can mean to me and has meant to me in dealing in the fact that He gave us His Son, who took our sin away from us and in obedience, and took the penalty for our failures. That I began to understand the principle of grace, and I know we'll deal with that a lot more in this book as we get through it.
Right. It's funny because I raised 3 boys with my wife, and I can remember every situation where there was an issue with them. It was always somebody else's fault. It was always blamed on somebody else. And so you can see it at a very young age that we began to do that without taking responsibility for ourselves. So we also found out at the beginning of chapter 2 that men seem to be very much struggle with admitting that they become discouraged and depressed. And we even found out that 80% of the suicides that are committed in the U.S. Are committed by men. And even in workshops for addicts, that 8 out of 9 people are men. So there, out of 10 people, there's barely 1 or 2 women. I don't know if you were surprised by those facts, John, but I was very surprised that men made up such a big part of both the suicides, but also addiction.
Yeah, and I guess I wasn't surprised that men maybe are more prone to suicide, but to say that 80% of all suicides are men and the majority of addictions are men rather than women, kind of caused me to focus on, which I think the book does, on the fact that men are different from women as to how they handle difficulties and struggles. And I guess it kind of goes back to the definition of men, how we are maybe brought up or taught as we learn what a man should do, how a man should respond to a problem or a struggle. And I think we as men, I've felt this myself, tend to want to hold it in, that we don't want anyone else to know about the fact that we're struggling with something or we're having a difficulty with something, and which we know can lead to depression. And yet women seem to be, I know in the case of my wife, I think about it, she's much more open to express her feelings and her emotions about things, and I'm more prone to want to keep it in and want to act like I've got it under control when I really don't. And those things, it just seems to me, are the types of differences between men and women that may have resulted in men being more prone to depression and ultimately suicide, or more prone to addiction, looking for something that will replace the feeling of loss or depression that they have in their lives. So it's really a revealing statistic, but I think it's something that all men should be aware of.
Right, right. Yeah, if you look on the page 9 of your reading, it talks about that we really have a hard time admitting weaknesses, and it's really a portrayal of our male identity. And our definition of a successful man in this culture does not include being depressed, down, or sad. And that's so reinforced in our culture through, TV, commercials, things like that, where, it just does not show a man sharing his difficulties with another man. It's always something gregarious going on in the commercials. So that's something that I think our culture doesn't do men well, and that sort of thing.
True, and also this chapter makes reference to shame, and I noted it, the reference to shame as the cancer of manhood. How do you think the feeling of shame, either for what you've done in the past or what you failed to do, how do you think that can impact your life? What does this chapter sort of refer to in terms of how that shame can impact you negatively?
Yeah, I think and can do it in a number of ways. We can, a lot of times, we feel shame, but in order not to admit that we've done something, we'll downplay what we've done, and we'll pretty much say, that wasn't so bad, or what that guy did was much worse than I did. And so we'll downplay it verbally, or we'll try to hide it, as we talked about before. We'll hide it from other people, and we won't be able to seek both either their forgiveness, God's forgiveness, for something that we feel ashamed about. And one of the things Jimbo talked to y'all last week about was that we always can justify our actions, and we always condemn other people's, and it's so obvious when we say what that person did was much worse than what I did. And so and what plays out in our minds often is what is played out in our actions. So what's in our mind also plays out in our actions, and they result in destroying relationships with people that we love. And that's something that if we can't ask for forgiveness, and if we can't admit it to friends and family, then that shame eats away at us and destroys our relationship both with our friends, our family, and ultimately with God. And it just robs us of our masculinity by not being able to share those kinds of things with people.
And don't you think that fear of shame, Mike, also causes us to be reluctant to share with others our concerns about our failures? That is, we try to hide them. I think that's one of the choices we have in dealing with failure, and that is we tend to try to think that we can hide it from God, but we more overtly try to hide it from others because we don't want them to think less of us.
Right.
And that's where I think shame becomes a cancer, in that it feeds on everything that we ultimately do and how we relate to other people, is that we hold things in and we don't share them, and as a consequence we try to almost put on a mask as to who we really are for fear that they'll think less of us.
Right. One of the examples in the book that I could really relate to was where the man and his wife were going for counseling, and they were doing it in order to make their marriage better. So that was actually a good thing and a strong thing for that husband to do. And yet he was so concerned when he was going into the buildings or walking in the parking lot that somebody would see him and think less of him because he was so weak and so troubled that he had to go seek counseling, where really what it showed him was how strong he was to either recognize that he needed help, and he was going to go get it, and he was willing to share it with another person, which was a counselor, whatever it was, and obviously he was sharing it with his wife as well. So, but I could see me doing that, going into the office and opening the door, sticking my head in to see if I saw anybody that I recognized, and because I would feel ashamed that I was having to go in and get counseling. So
right, that kind of relates back to something that Jimbo and John mentioned last week, dealing with the persona and that chapter, and that is who is our audience? Who are we trying to impress? Who are we trying to make think better of us? And that concern about what others think of us seems to be a huge impact on how we conduct ourselves in life. And really, we seem to be more concerned about what others think about us than what God thinks.
Right.
And how He sees us. And so I know we're going to get into more of that as we get into the book, but it just seems that when we get so focused on an audience of what others in the world think of us, we kind of spiral away from what's most important, and that is what God thinks of us.
And it works into how we respond to people, other people.
Mm-hmm.
That we have to be authoritative about things sometimes when we shouldn't be. So, I think our concern about what people think about us really impacts our life and how we respond to others. Do you see this causing us to miss the life that God really wants us to have?
I really think so, and I see it in the progression of my life. And again, as I say, it's been a process of learning and dealing with circumstances and dealing with other people, and that ultimately, when we are constantly concerned about what others think about us, we really don't have the peace that I think we ultimately ought to strive for, and that I think truly comes from what God has in store for us in our own lives. And it's always a struggle, and it's always something that we all should work toward, but that's what I come away from this feeling, that we do miss out on opportunities to be what God would have us be when we're constantly focused on what others think of us.
Right, right. And God created us for that deep relationship with Him, but He also created us to have deep relationships with our friends and our families as well. And I think that's what we really miss out on when we can't be honest and true with each other.
All right, well, we'll look forward to chapter 3 next week.
That's right. And hope y'all are enjoying it as much as we are, and look forward to being back with you again. Thanks.